in this cloud. Well, thank you for joining us in our May 12th edition of the League of Women Voters Water and Infrastructure Group. We are very excited to introduce our two speakers tonight, John Fleck and Eric Kuhn. John Fleck is a former science journalist and a writer in residence at the Utton Center, a water and natural resource policy group at the University of New Mexico School of Law, and professor of practice in water policy and governance in the University of New Mexico Department of Economics. He served for 5 years as the director of University of New Mexico's Water Resources Program. And he's going to be joined by his friend and co-author, Eric Kuhn, recently retired, worked for the Colorado River Water Basin, Water Conservation District from 1981 to 2018, including 22 years as general manager of the water district. The district is a water utility and policy agency covering most of the Colorado River Basin within Colorado. And thank you very much for, and I will turn it over to them.
Let me share screen.
While he's doing that, I just want to put in a little perspective about how California and Colorado are, and pretty much the entire Colorado River Basin are intimately tied to one another. Whether we're in our home in Redondo Beach or we're in our home in Boulder, our tap water is between 25% to 50% Colorado River Basin water, even though neither of our homes is in the natural basin of the river. And if you live in the Metropolitan Water District, which is most of Southern California, your water is on average 25% Colorado River water. And right this year, we are probably not going to get any Northern Sierra water through the State Water Project. So if you're looking to get your water instead from the Colorado River, John and Eric have some bad news for you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here. Eric and I are delighted. Eric and I both have interesting California connections. I grew up in Southern California. Eric spends part of his time in Southern California now. And we're both very interested in the problems of the Colorado River Basin as a whole, and this notion that we in the Western United States share this incredible river, this incredible resource. And the Colorado River Basin spans 7 states in the United States, 2 in Mexico, 30 Indian tribes, Native American indigenous communities who have been here from time immemorial, 5 million acres of irrigated farmland, 40-ish million people. We spend a lot of time trying to nail that number down. It's a little slippery, but it's around 40 million people. It's a lot of people. And for you all in Southern California, the Colorado River is a critical source of your water supply. And this is, it's fun for me. It's kind of like coming home for me. I grew up I'm just trying to get my mouse over the spot in Upland, in the Inland Empire's utility district, which is part of the Metropolitan Water District. And if you see this blue line headed into Southern California, into the Metropolitan Water District service area, this is the Colorado River Aqueduct, which, as Grace said, is a critical water supply for Southern California. One of the fascinating things to me as a person who began writing about water as a Southern Californian, this sort of amazing hydrologic infrastructure that we built to make the cities that you all live in possible. There's these sort of 3 artificial rivers that flow into this basin, which didn't have enough water to support the kind of the 20 million people that are there today in the Met service area. But Eric and I, finished writing this book back in what was it, Eric? Late 2018, December 2018, January 2019, and the Colorado River Basin in the 2 years since the book came out has been in dramatic decline. And this is a graph of the totals. The blue line is the total amount of water in storage in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So those are the two biggest reservoirs on the system. Those are the reservoirs that hold the water that ultimately is headed to you all, but is a part of a system that all of us depend on. I'm here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Colorado River drinking water in my jug here tonight. And if you look at this blue line in the 2 years, this is the total storage in the reservoirs. The green one is Lake Powell, the yellowy orange one is Mead. And if you look at this line, this is the 2 years since our book came out, right? Things are getting worse and worse and worse in the Colorado River Basin. And, we wrote this book to help us understand how we got into the mess we're in the Colorado River Basin. And that's really the sort of main focus of the book. But Eric and I are very active right now in helping members of our community in the Colorado River Basin think about what we do next, where we go from here, what it will take to maintain these vibrant, dynamic communities that all of us love. Eric and I and all of you on this screen, and I actually saw some names I recognize, people who elsewhere in the West. We're all dependent on this system, and we have to figure out how to make this thing work in the long run. And I wanted to share this picture. That's the graph on the right that I just showed you, and this picture I took on the left of Lake Mead when I was out there in December for a meeting of Colorado River water users, and brought a bike and spent some time riding around Lake Mead. And this is an old boat ramp, a boat dock that is now high and dry because the lake has dropped out from underneath it. We're in a heap of hurt right now. As John Ensminger, who's the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority in Las Vegas, said at a conference that Eric and I were at in Salt Lake City a couple of months ago, the future of the Colorado River is pain. And anybody who tells you anything different is selling you something. So this isn't not going to be easy. So Eric and I want to start by talking a little bit about how we came to write this book, how the two of us came together, what were the ideas that each of us were thinking about that sort of brought us together to think about writing the book that became Science Be Damned. Eric?
Yeah, this is a part of the Colorado River District Library. First, I'll tell you, like John, I have some California roots. My father actually was a graduate of a 1941 graduate of Needles High School. While I didn't grow up in California, I went to graduate school at Pepperdine. I lived there for a few years while I was there in the late 70s. And then I also have a daughter, a son-in-law, and grandkids that live in La Cañada. And I think because of COVID, my wife and I have probably spent over the last 2.5 years, probably far more time in California, clustered with them than we have here in Colorado. But this is the Colorado River District Library. And I began looking at a number of really classic books, old USGS reports that go back to literally the late 1800s that we had in our library. I began looking at compact documents with the district. The district was formed in 1937, but somehow it came across, probably from the attorney that formed it, documents that go before that. And when I started working at the district, the common theme was that, well, we don't have as much water as the compact negotiators thought, but it wasn't their problem. They were unlucky because they happened to negotiate this compact, and we'll see this in a graph later, in 1922. And it just so happens that the first 3 decades of the 20th century, 1900 to 1930 or so, is what we call the early 20th century pluvial. It's probably the wettest period. We talk about the current millennium drought being the driest period in the last 1400 years. Well, that pluvial that we were in winter, in which we negotiated this compact, might be the wettest. And anyway, I started thinking about that well into my career, and I started reading these, and I thought, no, there's something here that doesn't make sense, because folks like USGS scientist E.C. LaRue, who was in Pasadena, his collection is at the Huntington Library, basically had a pretty good understanding, a modern understanding of hydrology, and that there was really more like 15 million acre feet. Now that's before climate change. So when I say he had a modern understanding of the Colorado River, that was before the impacts of climate change. But the problem with the compact commissioners wasn't that they were unlucky, is that they didn't want to hear what Mr. LaRue and others had to say when they were making their decisions. You know, and I started writing about this in 2007. Didn't quite get into it in detail, called The Story of a Quest for Certainty on the Diminishing River. That was about every time we did a new study, it seemed, the longer the record, the less water we had. And it was really how it was this quest for a certain supply, this quest for certainty, this quest for guaranteed water on a river that kept getting smaller and smaller. And this was right at the advent, well, this was well into when scientists thought what they thought about climate change was in fact occurring, but it was right before the general public and water managers started to taking it seriously. And this other one, risk management strategies for the Colorado River Basin, I started to get into the kinds of things, this is in 2012, that we're doing today, like studying demand management, delivering water from Flaming Gorge down to Lake Powell. And I discussed the options in early days before we're here about, you know, pretty much what's going on today. John?
So at the same time Eric was doing this, and I didn't know Eric at the time, but Eric's a famous guy. And I was a journalist working on Colorado River stuff, and I was working on, at the time, what became another book, Waters for Fighting Over and Other Myths About Water in the West. And as I was working on the book, I was trying to make sense of this question of what did we know about how much water there was in the river. And the picture that you see on the top left of this slide is a whiteboard, is a photo from the whiteboard in my office when I was working on the book. And every time I would come across a new number, how much water somebody thought there was in the river, I'd write it down on my whiteboard. I was fascinated by the question, but I didn't have the technical chops to really work through the technical work in detail that these old scientists had done. But I knew about Eric's reports because Eric's a famous guy. So I'd read Eric's reports, and about the time about the time Waters for Fighting Over was done, and I was finished with that book, I was looking for a new project, and Eric and I, it was a am I remembering this right? It was one of those cocktail bar events in Caesar's Palace at the Colorado River water users. I believe so, it was a bar. I believe it was in a bar. I believe it was in cocktails. I believe there were those little snacky things that you eat.
Yeah, it was one of the receptions after
and Eric said, I have all this material, I'm looking for somebody to work with. And I said, I kind of don't have a job right now. And the River District had some money to support the research effort. And so Eric and I came together began working together back in 2016. One thing led to another, and it's a partnership that continues. We talk almost every day still to this day. And it's been a marvelously fun project because it's a meeting of two minds with two overlapping skill sets. Eric's a pretty good writer. I'm pretty good at some of the river math, but we have complementary skills. It resulted in this book, which was our attempt to answer this question about the river's flow. What did we know, and when did we know it, and how did we use it in making decisions? And this is a set of questions that as a journalist writing about the science politics policy interface. I've been really interested for a long time. How do we use science to make decisions, sometimes well, and sometimes not? And as Eric said, the classic story that we have always told, and I have written this story myself on a number of occasions, including my previous book, is that, well, the folks negotiating the Colorado River Compact, they did the best they could with the data they had at the time. How would they have known that it was an unusually wet period? And what Eric convinced me, and then what we together, I think, have convinced the community with this book is, no, in fact, they did, in fact, have available science that told them, or should have told them, that there's less water in the river than they had allocated in the compact. And we'll go through some of these numbers in more detail, but basically these people came together in 1922. They were trying to make a deal. They were trying to carve up the river so that the development could happen. And it was just a lot easier to do if they picked a big number and everybody could think, we're going to have plenty of water for the stuff that we want to do. Eric?
Yeah, and the book's basic message, when the foundations of the river allocation laws were developed, the 22 Compact, the Boulder Canyon Project Act, and the Mexican Treaty, I think those are kind of the three foundations, along with the Upper Colorado River Compact in 1948, that doesn't really impact Californians that much. But at every one of these major events on the river, the Boulder Canyon Project Act is what authorized Hoover Dam. It ratified the compact. The Mexican Treaty, where we agreed to share water with Mexico. Every one of these major decisions, there was science available that suggested there was a much smaller river, and it was ignored. John?
So why was it ignored? Politics and marketing of the projects. You had a development community, you had boosters who wanted to build the kind of dams in canals, in farm communities, in cities that we have today. And it was easier to do that if you promised more water. It was easier to make the political case for, and this is hard for me, but I think it should be hard for every single person in this Zoom call, because we all benefit from that. We all live in these communities. We have richly benefited from all the work that these people did to create the communities that we live in and love today. So the glib quick message we're offering you here sounds pretty critical, but these people were trying to do really big, hard, complicated things with grand ambitions, and we are the beneficiaries of those ambitions, right? We all live in these places. We all use this water. So it's I think important for us to be a little bit humble as we look back on and sort of modestly criticize them. But the fact is, now we're in this mess, and the question is, what do we do next? And I'm in the middle of trying to write a talk for a conference. Eric's been helping me talk about this for a conference next week, trying to talk about what do we do next. And it's a really hard problem, right? Eric?
Yeah, and I might add that I was a part of the Colorado team that negotiated the interim surplus guidelines, the existing 2007 interim guidelines. I've been associated with interstate issues really since 1982. And what I saw in the early 2000s was a continuation of what the decision makers, the mistake the decision makers had made in the past, only this time it was dealing with climate change. I mean, we turned the corner in my view. I think there's not a water manager in the basin, maybe just a few, that want to ignore climate change. But when we negotiated the interim guidelines, we knew about climate change, but we just decided that there's too much uncertainty. So let's go with what we're certain about. And what we were certain about were flows that were much more, much higher than what the climate scientists were telling us would be getting there in the future. So in the future, we're going to have to do some things that are very different. We talk about Herculean conservation efforts and other things. We're just going to have to change the way we do business. The fixed obligations, the fixed contracts on a river that is so uncertain now due to climate change just won't exist. They're incompatible.
So let's go back to the beginning of our story, because you know, in significant part, the story in our book is a story about this really amazing, interesting character called Eugene Clyde LaRue. LaRue was a scientist who worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, and long before I knew Eric's interest in LaRue, because he's a bit of an obscure character, I was also fascinated by him. And I first noticed him when I saw this picture that I'm showing you today, which is it's in the U.S. Geological Survey's photo archives from the 1923 Bird's Eye expedition down the Grand Canyon to try to measure the Colorado River. And this is Eugene Clyde LaRue measuring the flow of Nankoweap Creek in the upper reaches of the Grand Canyon. This is a guy who went out and measured the river. And he and his colleagues measured the river in excruciating detail. And, you know, I think, you know, one of Eric's insights in looking at LaRue's work, and I tried to read LaRue's work, 10 years ago, long before I knew Eric. And, you know, as I said, I just didn't have the technical chops to work through the math because it's complicated. But what, you know, Eric concluded in stuff that he worked on in our book is that LaRue really came to us with this really modern understanding of how the river worked, how much water it had, as long ago as 1916. So his first report was this report, U.S. Geological Survey Water Supply Paper 395. It was published in 1916, and at that time they had gauges on the river, actual measurements of the flow in the river for a decade and a half, in a few places slightly longer. We hadn't been measuring flow that long, but LaRue used some very clever techniques, and we'll talk about one of them in a moment, to try to estimate what past flows on the river had been before we had gauge records, to understand what had happened in the past. And what he concluded was, again, 1916, Eugene Clyde LaRue, and this is not some flaky fringe scientist, this is the guy we as a nation gave the job of telling us how much water there was in the Colorado River. He was the lead scientist for the U.S. Geological Survey. The flow of the Colorado River and its tributaries is not sufficient to irrigate all the irrigable lands lying within the basin. And LaRue did something really clever, and LaRue didn't invent this technique, but he was the first one to apply it in search of solutions to political and policy problems. He used measurements of the elevation of the Great Salt Lake. So it's a closed basin. So when there's more water flowing in during wet times, the Great Salt Lake rises. And when there's less water flowing in, evaporation exceeds inflow and it shrinks. We have, thanks to the colonial settlers in that area, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, excellent records of the history of the rise and fall of the Great Salt Lake from the time period when the Mormons arrived in the late 1840s and 1850s. And he figured, you know, the Great Salt Lake, if you can kind of see on the map here, is kind of near the upper part of the Colorado River Basin. So it's probably a good proxy. And he looked at that and he said, whoa, there were these big droughts in this time before the wet period we're in now. And he issued that warning. 1916, he issued his first warning. 1922, the Colorado River Compact was negotiated. He was ignored. Eric and I tell the story in the book about how he was sort of literally kept out of the process. They willfully kept LaRue away from the negotiators. It was negotiated in 1922, but it wasn't completed which required ratification of Congress until 1929. But in 1925, he provided a much more detailed warning, a second report. There's not enough water. And there was this moment for me when we were working on the book. One of the things that I was always looking for, because I'm the storyteller on the team, was elements of storytelling, little dramas. And there was this moment I was reading through old congressional testimony, and LaRue went before a group of senators, 1925, testifying before the Senate, and he says to them, "There is not enough water for what you're trying to do." And I kept reading page after page after page after page in the testimony from that hearing. Nobody ever asked a follow-up question about that. They never asked him a question. And it was just like this stunning moment for me, this realization that, yeah, they really were willfully and mindfully and intentionally ignoring that. So in 1929, Congress ratified the Colorado River Compact, and that created the federal funding and legal authorization and the momentum for the construction of Hoover Dam. And they did that because there was a second character in our book who was the head of the Reclamation Service at the time. It was before it became the Bureau of Reclamation. It was called the Reclamation Service, who provided the technical expertise for the commissioners in lieu of LaRue. He kept in charge of, right, and those of you who have worked with science and policy, know that the person who has control of the flow of information to the decision makers, it's a really powerful position. And he told them, y'all, there's plenty of water, sufficient water for the irrigation of all the lands. So you have this fundamental tension between these two characters.
And I might add, John, that we don't want to make Arthur Palau Davis to be some kind of negative character or whatever, or foil. He was not. There's a dam named after him. He was a great visionary. He's the one that really, pulled the Reclamation Service out of a funk when the early projects by the Reclamation Service were economic failures. And it was his vision that basically said, let's add power to this because there's a growing market in Southern California for power. And we can turn these projects into economic wins from losses. And there is a key thing here where he didn't really push very hard, but he says, could be favorably reached. So he was saying there's enough water for lands that could be favorably reached. His ideas and his scientists' ideas of the lands that could be favorably reached and the states were fundamentally different. Of course, the states thought that they could irrigate all kinds of lands more than, especially in the Upper Basin, than what Davis considered feasible. So Davis is not, one of the persons we talked about publishing this book wanted to see good guys and bad guys, and they're not. They're both good and bad. They're all human. They all had. LaRue had his foibles. LaRue was a very difficult person to get along with. His personality. He was warned by his contemporaries about the way he delivered his message. So. We wanted to just present the reality, not present good guys and bad guys in this book. And here's the estimates of flow of natural flow at Lee Ferry during the 20s. Stabler. The long-term average in the 19th or the 20th century, from 1906 to 1999, is about 15 million. LaRue figured it was 15 million. Stabler. One of his contemporaries who used a gauge at the Yuma Railroad to reconstruct the flows came up with 14.3. Davis's estimate was 18.1, and Delph Carpenter, the Colorado, who's considered father of the compacts, and really was the legal brains behind the compact, he and Hoover, figured it was 17.5. So you can see the USGS nailed it, and the folks that were trying to that were negotiating the compact had optimistic numbers.
And it's important to think about what these numbers are telling us, because if Davis and Carpenter are right, there's plenty of water in the river for all the developments that we went ahead and built. Those are the numbers that they used to allocate water. So they based the allocations on those big numbers. We really have those smaller numbers that Stabler and LaRue got right. So for a century, we've been trying to fit big development into a pattern left by a smaller river. And that leaves us two kinds of risk that we face in the Colorado River Basin. There is the hydrologic risk. There is simply not enough water. This is a picture I took 10 years ago at that same boat ramp on Lake Mead, cracked mud and an old something that fell off a boat and was being revealed as the lake dropped. It's now, the lake's now 25 feet below where the water was when I took this picture. And that's hydrologic risk. There's not enough water. And then there's this really complicated set of institutional risks, what I think of as call institutional risks, which are about the rules for allocation of water. So now we have to have these arguments. Well, there's less water. Do you take the shortage? Do you take the shortage? And that's about the rules we use. And this is the arena where I think a lot of the most interesting and important discussions are underway today. But the reality is, and Eric, why don't you take him through these numbers, Eric? Because this, I think, tells the story of a shrinking river.
Yeah, and I want to say these are estimated flows of the river system below Yuma, so the entire river system, not Lee's Ferry. I think because Lee's Ferry is the dividing point, and a lot of studies been focused on Lee's Ferry. When you read in the press and they talk about the flow at Lee Ferry, remember they're talking about maybe 90% of the flow, but there are tributaries in the lower basin, and primarily not in California, but in Arizona. So this was the water that they thought was available for development over time. You can see the 22 Compact and the Boulder Canyon Project Act, the overwhelming belief, not including the USGS scientists, but from the decision makers, was 20 million acre feet. By 1944, it was 18. That was still high. By the time we negotiated the Upper Basin Compact, 17. When the Central Arizona project was authorized, it was 16. We've had numerous long-term paleo reconstructions, most of them at Lee Ferry, but the long-term average, when you go back hundreds of years, is about 15.5 million acre feet. Now we hit climate change and what's happened since 2000 with what this concept called aridification. As temperatures go up, as the monsoons get less, with the soils dry out, especially in the upper basin. And even though we had an 85% snowpack last year, we're going to have a 35% runoff. We had an 85% to 90% snowpack this year, we're going to have a 50% runoff. The water is not going into the river. It's going into groundwater to replete soil moisture, and it's going into the atmosphere. So we're seeing a thirsty atmosphere is what they call it. That higher temperatures, the bottom line is the higher the temperatures for the same precipitation, the less flow. And the climate science on this in the last 10, especially 10 years, has been, there's just been numerous, and they're all saying the millennium drought is really not a drought. It's the new abnormal. I don't want to call it a new normal because there is no normal. The system isn't going to go down and stabilize out at a lower level like 13. As long as we have carbon dioxide and methane emissions and temperatures are going up, the river is going to be unpredictable. It's going to go down to levels that we don't know. And there's going to be an occasionally really big year like the Oroville Dam 2017, where you get a training of very large wet systems that come into California. One of these days, one of them might come in through Southern California into the Rocky Mountains. So at the same time we've seen these really dry years, we also had record in 2019 in Colorado, we had record avalanches, and we've been keeping avalanche data for 100 plus years. So the atmosphere is changed by climate change. Climate change is changing the hydrologic cycle. For the most part, it's going to be drier. We're going to have less water. It's going to be very unpredictable, very uncertain. And there's going to be these very large wet events that we can't predict that are going to hammer us as well. So we're in for a new hydrologic world. And I think one of John and my, what we wanted to do with this book is remind people of what they did in the past, so we wouldn't continue to allocate water based on not believing the scientists. You know, in the 1920s, it might have been LaRue. Now it's the climate scientists. I hope we're there, not 100% sure, but I hope we're there. Now this is the river the compact negotiators divided up just no longer exists. This shows annual flows from 1906 to 1929, 17.8 million acre feet. These are natural flows. The Bureau of Reclamation estimates, we used to call them virgin flows. The natural flow is the amount of water that would have been there if it wasn't for projects by man. So you can see that 30-year period, 17.8 million. The long-term average is about 14.7. And from most of the 20th century, it was about 14.3. Recently, it's 12.3. So you can see this step down. I don't know where it's going to be in the future, but we better not plan on 14 million. And we probably shouldn't plan on 12 million because there may not be 12 million. It may be much less than that.
So it is really important to remember that it's not like we've been sitting around doing nothing about this. And I always like to use a version of this graph. So this is water use in the Colorado River Basin. That sort of mustard yellow is the lower basin, Nevada, Arizona, and California. The green line is the upper basin states, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. And you see that mustard yellow line is going down. Water use is going down. It's not like we've been ignoring this and using more and more water. Water conservation efforts have been substantial. They've been successful. If by successful you mean reducing use, if by successful you mean reducing use enough to keep up with climate change, the answer is no. And in the upper part of the Colorado River Basin, water use basically stable. It goes up and down a lot year to year, variability, but it's basically been stable since the late 1980s. And remember, population has grown enormously in these places since those times, and agricultural productivity has gone up enormously. So we have done a good job of doing more with less water. And so it's important to remember, like that's success. And this is, I think, especially the messaging people like Eric and I have to think about doing now is, we don't want people to get hopeless. We don't want people to feel hopeless because we have done a lot of work and it's been good work. And I think that's an important part of this message, because whatever we do going forward has to build on the skills and experience that we have in doing those things. So where do we go from here? Messages from the river's future. And this is something Eric and I have been talking a lot about recently. And so you're sort of getting our first cut at this. How will decision makers use the science in the future? Incredibly important. There are a whole bunch of unresolved legal questions that will have to be worked out. There are enormous questions of equity here, both in terms of the upper Colorado River Basin, where Eric and I primarily live, and the lower Colorado River Basin. The river was kind of split in half by the compact. You saw my graph. Y'all down there are using a lot more than we are. There's a real fairness question about this that needs to be considered as we think about how we scale back our use. And much of the rules that we have written depended on certainty. They allocated specific amounts of water. We can't do that anymore. We all have to be prepared to reduce our allocations as supplies go down and not say, yeah, but my lawyers tell me our share of the river is safe. You guys have to have the cuts, because everybody has a lawyers can say that, and there's not enough water for all the lawyers to be right? So somebody's going to be wrong and somebody's going to lose, right? So what does the future hold? Deep hydrologic uncertainty. The rules aren't sufficient, and they're not moving quickly enough to reduce our use, what we need. All that conservation we've all done, only the start. We're all going to have to do a lot more. there will be less irrigated acreage in the Colorado River Basin in the future. There's no way around the math of that. And the question we have is, how do we do all of that? And it's a pretty scary time for those of us who work on this river, with the reservoirs declining so rapidly and us losing our margins of safety. So, you know, that's where we're at. And I think this is my last slide. This is our last slide. And I hope we've left enough time for questions if people want to, if people have them. We would love to hear your questions. When you ask us questions, you help us think about what we're doing here. So let me maybe stop the share and we can get the group up.
Well, can you go back to show the slide where of the Colorado River Basin and the shaded areas of the of who depends on Colorado River, because it has Southern California and the Colorado Front Range on it?
Yeah, this one right here. There we go.
Yeah, because it shows Denver. I don't know if you've heard, but in California, we have a housing problem. And when we don't provide housing for our young people and our lower income people, they end up moving to other states, often to other Colorado River Basin states. So it's everyone's problem. And I just want people to look at the shaded areas that are outside the river basin, but that are still heavily dependent on it. And can you say a little bit more about what's happening in the Coachella valleys and the 30-70 split between all the people along the coast in the shaded area in Southern California? Like, California gets the lion's share of the Colorado River Basin water, but 70% of it goes to a few hundred farmers over here in the desert. So can you talk some more about that?
Well, so I'm going to push back on that, because a few hundred farmers is not right. This is half a million acres of irrigated acreage and the communities of more than 100,000 people out there, who, and this is really important, like all of us, built their communities around the idea that there was water for us. And we as a nation and as communities decided irrigation farming is something we want to do. That was our national goal, and that was communities' goals. And all these communities developed in good faith around those goals and those motivations. And it's really important, I think, not to say, yeah, it's just that small group of farmers, because it's not. It's a large community of people who work in agriculture. And really importantly,
that's important, because
right, and also really importantly, there's a lot of real justice and equity issues around the communities that are part of that. Social and racial justice issues around the communities that are part of that. And really importantly, and this is, a point that Ann Castle, someone that Eric and I work real closely with, former Assistant Secretary Interior, who works on tribal water issues, there are a whole bunch of tribal communities, many of whom are agricultural, including many along the main stem of the river here, the Colorado River Indian tribes, and the Kachan down here, who also are farming people, who are river people, who have been left out of some of the allocation of water, so that, for example, here in Albuquerque, where I live, there was a project authorized by Congress in 1962 that was going to simultaneously bring water to my city and to the Navajo Nation. 1962, 60 years ago. Our project was completed in the 1970s. The Navajo project is not yet completed. So at the same time, I'm saying everybody's got to use less water. I've got to carve out in my moral argument about this, which is there are some communities who were left out all along who we may need to carve out more water for them, which means even less for us. But there's a legal, but also a moral question about that as well.
But don't they have, aren't the Indian treaties the most senior water rights holders? Therefore,
they are on paper,
right.
but
And
those
so,
are not, in many cases, there is no wet water that goes with that paper allocation, because of a history of colonial racism in this country, the colonial settlers got federal money to build water projects so that on paper, the Navajo Nation does have all this water. Albuquerque got its water project built. The Navajo Nation hasn't yet. So there was a disproportionate benefit in the spending of federal dollars that disproportionately left the tribal communities out. So they have paper water rights, but they don't have the water.
Donna has a question.
Donna.
I forgot to unmute. My interest is in solutions. Are there any solutions that are being presented? I understand there is some money that's gone into at least Hoover Dam from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that was passed recently. But what will that money be used for? You know, what are some positive things? Are there any solutions? I know desalination in the Bay was mentioned. I know that in Orange County and San Diego County, the wastewater reclamation and purification is being effective. Do you have any, are there any solutions that we can hang on to so that we don't go drown ourselves?
Yes. Yeah. Let me just, yeah.
The water, other than more conservation, which is already killing a lot of farming and a lot of land.
I think the answer lies in technology and recycling.
Yes.
And when you look at the fact that Nevada and Arizona are investing in a recycling plant being built by Metropolitan Water District, even 10 years ago, that would have been unheard of, that kind of cooperation. The other thing that I see, quite frankly, and I've always said, the future of the Colorado River is about grass. When I say grass, I mean two things. For example, over half of the water that the city of Denver uses goes to outdoor lawn watering. Las Vegas has been a success story because they've basically reduced turf, unnecessary turf. Now, I know in climate change, there's a heat island issue, but I think the reality is we can serve a lot of people with the amount of water. I read recently that 85% of the water in Israel is recycled.
Right.
In California, it's about 25%. In Colorado, it's less than 5%. So we have a long ways to go with recycling. And then we also have a long ways to go with controlling ornamental turf and in what I would also call ornamental agriculture. It's not so much in California as it is in the Upper Basin and other places where you have acres and acres of hay and pasture grass that are there in some cases for the view shed. In other cases, they support a few cows. I think the future is grass. There are now some downsides because irrigation of upstream, valleys and the mountains is also what provides late season return flows. Irrigation has replaced the beavers when it comes to recharging these groundwater aquifers. But there are success stories. They center around recycling. They center around controlling turf. They also center around innovative arrangements between agriculture and the municipalities.
Thank you so much.
Other hands, Margie. George, someone.
George goes before me.
George. You're muted, George. George, you're muted.
He needs to unmute. There.
Yeah, I had a question about pumped hydro. Pumped hydro, whether LADWP has a $3.6 billion project being studied at Lake Powell. As I understand it, they're going to pump water uphill from Lake Powell using solar panels and then let it run back down and generate power. So my question is, it seems like this kind of water use is different from most in that you're putting back most of the water that you're taking out. And so, but when I read about this project, I see there's a lot of objections from different water factions claiming that this was not sensible and so forth. So can you provide information about that? And I guess one thing I'm interested in is the degree to which from a climate change fight, using pumped hydro is one of the best things you can do because it's sort of like a giant battery, and it's a very long duration battery, which regular batteries can't do. So, is there some way that the water deciders can somehow expedite that? And what is there some limit on how much pumped hydro that we could have?
Well, there's a huge transmission problem too. One of the problems with some of the proposed pumped hydro, or quite frankly, is that they're going into canyons that are considered by some sacred and considered by others to be pristine. And you're reminding people of the construction of dams in Glen Canyon and other things, and there's a pushback there. I will say my background is also in electricity. Years ago, though, pumped hydro is going to have to make its way, and it's going to have to compete with other storage opportunities like compressed air and batteries. And right now, it is the massive construction that it takes to build the billions of dollars. Is that it's just not right now competitive with other ways of doing business. Now there are, of storing energy. That's what I understand, but there are active proposals for pump storage, and we'll just see how those go.
So we have, I don't want to miss Jenny's question. So I've got that, Jenny saw it. Margie.
Yeah, my question is a little bit different. I know that because of the flows in the Colorado River, that water has not been making it to the Gulf of California out in Baja, right?
Right.
And that's been going on, I don't know how many years, but my understanding of places where rivers empty and they carry sediment is they end up providing fertility for those areas in the water. And so my concern basically are whales who birth their calves there and are now finding there isn't anything to eat. So I'm wondering at what point the ecological part of that equation is going to come into play.
Eric?
You've got, you're beyond my expertise there. I know the river has not made it connected to the Gulf of California for a long time. There are fertility issues, but it's been, and there are problems. There are endangered fish species, the small dolphin in the Gulf of California. And I quite frankly, I don't know the answer to your question. I fear you may be right, but I don't know that there's anything, I think that climate change is going to make dealing with the environment just that much more difficult, quite frankly.
So I want to take Jenny's question in the chat, and then Ann, I'll go to you. Jenny's question is about the Philmead first proposal, and for those on the call who are not familiar with that, that's the idea that it's a proposal to, given the fact that we have so much less water, move all the water down from Lake Powell to Lake Mead, keep Powell empty and put more water in Mead. And Jenny's asking about the avoidance of evaporative losses from Lake Powell, and the best analysis of this in terms of the evaporative losses from the two reservoirs and the benefits of filling Mead first or filling Powell first was done by Jack Schmidt at Utah State, who's a colleague of ours. Eric has worked very closely with Jack on Colorado River Studies. He's the Center for the Future of the Colorado River at Utah State. And Jack's analysis suggested that in fact, the evaporative savings are small. And in fact, so the change in the evaporative savings from doing this are small, or so small that they're within the margin of error of our ability to measure evaporation. And that's because you are increasing evaporation in Lake Mead and decreasing it in Lake Powell. So you're not merely, so the two balance each other out closely. There's maybe a little bit of savings by doing fill Mead first, but it's not a lot. It's nevertheless an interesting proposal, but we're seeing right now concerns by the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Interior that the practical physical operation of Glen Canyon Dam may not allow them to get there, even if we decided there were water savings to be had because of the function of the dam.
Oh, and one thing is that Lake Powell is at higher elevation, so it has less vapor pressure. So the vapor pressure of water, there's less atmosphere there. So the vapor pressure of water, you can the evaporative loss could be more because it's higher elevation. But on the other hand, Lake Mead is lower and hotter, and so hotter water evaporates more. So
there's also the geometry of the lakes, and I mean
the surface area and all that, but whatever, it's a wash.
And
okay. When I was on the Water Authority board, our attorney was Paul Engstrom, who in his day was pretty well known as a water attorney. And he said more than once that he believed that because of the power and the population of dense urban areas, that the law of the river at some point would be overturned because the need of people would take priority over, I believe he was talking about alfalfa and stuff like that at the time. However, we also still need to eat on a regular basis, and we all want to do that. So I've always had a lot of trouble processing that. Do you guys have any sense that there's any likelihood that there would be any dramatic changes to the law of the river now? Because it certainly favors the senior water right people, not the Indians, but imperial irrigation, those kinds of districts.
There's a saying, and I think is true, that's going to be shown to be true, is that water flows uphill to money.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, I don't know anybody that will refute that, as long as there's a market that allows the water to flow uphill. So my own personal view, and this is a personal one, is we're never going to change the compact. We're just going to interpret in ways that get the job done. So that we will learn to live with the water that we've got. We have no other choice other than, pumping water from the Yukon or Mississippi River and those kinds of crazy things. That's not going to happen. So I go back to, we'll figure it out. We'll do what people do in Australia, what they do in Israel. We will learn how to live with the water we've got, and we'll probably have a thriving community doing so.
And especially in agriculture. One of the things that Eric and I argue in the closing chapter of the book, are, oh, okay, so we got this mess, what the heck do we do? We issued a call for a new rural urban social compact to deal with this issue, because the cities do have a need for certainty of supply. And we know they can use a lot less, but the joke is that you can't fallow an apartment complex, right? So cities need supply. And the rural communities, I believe, have a right to continue to exist. And the question is, how do we work a collaborative arrangement where the cities can buy that certainty and have flexibility in the water arrangements with the rural communities? And we have a wonderful example of this in the Palo Verde Irrigation District, which has an agreement with the Metropolitan Water District, which under which farmers are paid to fallow a field. And that water can go to you. In negotiating that agreement, they set limits. You can only fallow so much of the land. The farmers get cash flow, and farming is tough, so you get the money for the new pickup trucks. And rather than the sort of brute political force of taking water away by force, you have money, you have water flowing uphill toward that money, but in a way that respects the continued integrity of the community. It's not a perfect deal, but there are challenges and problems in the what we call the move from locations, right? These rural communities. But there are ways we can do those things, I hope, because I treasure and love these places. In working on my books for the last, I'm a city guy, but in working on my books for these last 10 years, I've spent a lot of time in these rural communities, and I love these people and I love these places, and I want to see them exist and survive too. So
Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you for the invitation.
we have another question. Are we running out of time?
We have more questions in the chat box, and we have 2 more people with hands. I'll let Joan ask in the chat box, who is negotiating the changes to the current water compact?
There's no formal negotiations going on. There's a series of negotiations going on, some of them led by the state agencies, like the Colorado River Board of California, Chris Harris, the manager of the Central Arizona Project, the executive director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, and their counterparts in Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. Those are what we would call the principals, but there's also a lot of negotiations and discussions going on, and participation by non-governmental entities, major utility districts. So it used to be just a small group of old white men, quite frankly, for most of the Colorado River Basin. And it's in recent years, it's gotten quite a bit of diversity now.
What was the meeting that took place about 6 weeks ago where the tribes were at the table for the first time?
Well, there was a meeting of the states and the tribes. The current Secretary of the Interior has made it clear. This is not going to be a set of negotiations that's controlled by just 1 or 2 people from each state. This is going to be very inclusive, and the tribes are going to be there, as are the non-governmental organizations. And quite frankly, Mexico is there. We have a treaty with Mexico, and we have water as one of those water agreements we've made with Mexico is in the, among all kinds of other problems with Mexico, immigration and those kinds of things, water has been a success.
So that was the question. I'm sorry, Donna, I want to skip over you because he's talking about Mexico, and that was my question, which is that you can only move wet water if you've got the energy, but you can move paper water. And I know that we have multinational water agreements with Mexico, but for both the Colorado River and the Rio Grande. And there was some unrest with Mexican farmers who found out that they were going to have their water curtailed this year because it was going to be used for some sort of multinational international water swap. Can you talk some more about that? What was going on with the water transfers?
Do you know what's going on there? I do not.
Yeah, I do not. Despite the fact that I live on the Rio Grande, I don't follow the U.S.-Mexico Rio Grande issues. So I'm sorry, I can't.
Yeah, because the Rio Grande farmers in the really surprised that they were party to a water swap, and therefore they were going to have
I
some
can
water.
mute it. That won't, wait.
Yeah,
I-
the,
Let's see.
the same treaty, the 1944 treaty that governs the Colorado River is a three-river treaty, the Tijuana, the Colorado, and the Rio Grande.
You,
It requires the United States to deliver water to Mexico on the Colorado. It requires Mexico to deliver water to the United States on the Rio Grande, the tributaries of the Rio Grande that flow into the Rio Grande south of Fort Quitman. So this involves that Mexican water, which is a treaty requirement for Mexico to deliver. And that's why those farmers were being shorted, because it was Mexico's legal obligation to deliver water into the Rio Grande for use by farmers in the United States down in Texas. But I don't know a lot about it. The other folks here at the Etten Center that I work with work on that, but I don't. No, Dawn, didn't you have another question? Or I don't want to. You're muted.
I put it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
My concern, I live in the Central Valley, and that's probably the direction we're going up here, is to fallow land. But when we say fallow land as a solution, we're also saying that we're growing less food as a solution. And I don't think it's a very good solution. I think it should be watched because climate change isn't just in California, it's worldwide. And we will still need to eat as well as be able to drink water in order to live. So that's my lecture that I give everybody.
It's a challenging problem. It's a challenging problem. There's no easy answers. Yeah.
Grace, can I speak?
Jeanette, yeah, Jeanette.
Yeah, I can't get my video to work, but I'm here. So there's also problems with things like I understand that there are people from Saudi Arabia who are growing things in the eastern part of the southern part of California and sending it back to their own countries. And some of the things that are like the almonds that are in California are mostly sent abroad. So it's hard to figure out how would you make those issues visible enough that you can figure out how to fix them.
I have a little bit of a problem with this argument because there's an excellent study done by the Pacific Institute Water Research Group out of the Bay Area, really excellent work. This is the idea of what we call virtual water, which means water used to produce a thing in one place that is sent to another. And California, where you all are, is a net virtual water importer through all the various things that are manufactured in other places or crops grown in other places that are imported into California. So it's a slippery slope to say we shouldn't export a particular thing, because then if everybody's doing this, then California is a net loser in that. So it's a bit of a tricky problem. But if we were to say we're going to, let's just hypothetically say somehow, we don't really have legal authorities, but hypothetically say we're going to ban exports of irrigated crops from California, those farmers still have land and water and they would grow something else and the water would still be used. So it wouldn't solve the water problem. It would be using the water in a way we might be more comfortable with. But unless we're simultaneously stopping that export and also fallowing that land, we don't get the water. The farmer would use it for a crop that's sold here in the United States. So I don't see it as a solution. But it's also food going to places to people, feeding people, or alfalfa feeding animals that people eat.
20% of last year's almond crop didn't get sold and are sitting in warehouses. And we're going to add 30% of this year's crop to the warehouses.
I just don't want to run out of food.
Almonds isn't food.
Good food.
But I do have a question about aridification because of, I don't know if you've been following the water wars. Westminster, Colorado, a suburb of Denver, is is a newer city, so they didn't get water rights. So they went and they bought water from ranchers in the Big Thompson, from who have water shares in the Big Thompson water project that brings water across Rocky Mountain National Park. And there's a lot of fear in the source in the Big Thompson area about whether or not there's going to be more blowing dust because of water exports to Westminster. And I found this really ironic because they talk about the way of life in the Fort Collins. It's just west of Fort Collins. They're worried about losing their way of life by losing their water, but they've only had their water since like 1930 something or 1940 something. And like, how do we adjudicate this? Like, does Westminster get the water? Does the Big Thompson ranchers get the water? Do we leave it in the river? Like, how do we solve this big problem? And the very real problem about, okay, they've already disturbed, they've already dug up the prairie, and we're going to get dust if we don't like irrigate it or grow something there. And that's the problem that we're going to have in the Imperial Valley, and that we're already seeing in the Owens Valley, is that blowing dust problem.
Yeah, well, let me just say, the Colorado Big Thompson project set rules in place years ago that allow individuals who own shares to sell them. So the people that sold those shares to the Westminster did that voluntarily. And in Colorado, if you're going to convert agricultural water to municipal water, you need to have a court-approved plan to restore native vegetation to what you're taking water off of. Now, that was only implemented about 20 years ago. So some of the stuff has happened before that. It was not required to do revegetation. You know, the bottom line is, as we say, water moves uphill to money. You could have, 30 years ago, you could buy a CBT share for a couple $1,000s. Today, they're running $60,000 a share. So you can see the value has really moved that up. When I started working, 75% of the share owners, 70 to 75% were in agriculture. Today, 70% are in municipal, 70, 75, or industrial, or beer. One of the largest uses of CBT water is in beer plants. Yeah, difficult issue, but each state is struggling with it in different ways. That's my view. And in Colorado, I think we got a good handle on it.
Do you think California should follow the native revegetation requirement?
Absolutely, but I would assume some counties have the authority to do that.
Okay. Thank you very much, guys. It's been really interesting.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.